What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. This week on Not Your Average Meta, we've got another great game brought to you from the Hobby Horse in Taylorville, Illinois. First up this week, we have Gavin playing his new favorite deck, the Beamtown Bullies. This deck looks to fill his graveyard up with devastating creatures and then use his commander's ability to bring them back into play under his opponent's control. Next, we have Ryan back giving his Orah Skyclave Hierophant deck another try. This is a cleric tribal deck that looks to use classic Orzhov sacrifice shenanigans to create a recurring value engine to win the game. Then we have Justin playing his good old faithful Yuriko the Tiger Shadow deck. This deck looks to deal combat damage with his ninjas in order to flip high CMC cards off the top of his library in order to take out his opponents. Finally, we have Fallgirl playing his partner commander pairing of Rhoda, Geist Avenger, and Timin, Youthful Geist. This is a tap-down spirit tribal deck where Fallgirl looks to tap down his opponent's creatures in order to make his commander big enough in order to swing in for lethal commander damage. Now the other fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Justin plays a command tower, then pays 1 for a Mistcloaked Herald. Fog draws Prayer Stream for turn and passes. Gavin draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He then pays the 1 life to crack it and goes to get a tapped Zeotor's Proving Grounds. Ryan draws for turn and plays a tapped Castle Lochthwain before passing. Justin draws and plays a Vault of Whispers before going to combat, swinging his Herald at Gavin, who can't block. He then Jitsus in Yuriko, and after damage is dealt, Justin reveals the top card of his library, dealing 4 damage to each of his opponents. Fog draws for turn and plays the Plains before paying 2 for a Twin Blade Geist. Gavin draws and plays a Mount of Return. He then pays 2 for Borderland Explorer, which has Ryan and himself discarding a card in order to go get a basic land for their hands. Ryan draws and plays a Shattered Sanctum for turn before paying 1 for a Chromatic Sphere. Justin draws and plays a Tapu Seju. He then pays 1 to recast his Mistcloaked Herald and an additional 1 for Universal Automaton. Justin then swings Yuriko at Ryan, who can't block. He then reveals the top card of his library, dealing 3 damage to each opponent. Fog draws for turn and plays an island. He then pays 3 to cast a Brian Comer, which creates a 1/1 spirit token when it enters play. Gavin draws for turn and plays an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth. He then casts a Deathrite Shaman and passes. Ryan draws for turn and plays a Swamp. He then pays 1 to sack his Fear to create a white mana and draw a card. Ryan then taps out and casts Ghostly Prison. Justin draws and then goes straight to combat, swinging his Heralded Fog. Fog can't block, so before damage is dealt, Justin ninjutsus in an Ingenious Infiltrator. Once damage is dealt, he reveals the top card of his library, dealing 2 damage to his opponents. Second main, Justin plays an island for turn and casts a Silver Fur Master. Fog draws for turn and plays another Plains. He then pays 2 to cast a Dorothea, Vengeful Victim, and then another 2 for a Shacklegeist. Gavin draws and plays a Forest before paying 3 for a Staff of Domination. Ryan draws for turn and plays a Maze of Ith before tapping out to cast a Wrath of God. In response, Gavin uses his Deathrite Shaman to exile a card from a graveyard and gain 3 life. The rest of the board then gets wiped of all the creatures and Ryan passes. Justin draws for turn and then pays 1 to cast a Triton Shorestalker, and then another 1 to recast Mistcloaked Herald again. Fog draws and plays a Rogue's Passage for turn before paying 4 to cast his commander, Rhoda. Gavin draws for turn and plays a Swamp before paying 1 to cast Reanimate, targeting his Pathways of Ulamog in his graveyard, losing 11 life. He then pays 4 to cast his commander, the Beamtown Bullies, and passes. Ryan draws for turn and also plays a Swamp before paying 4 to cast his commander, Orah. Justin draws for turn and plays a Swamp. He then goes to combat, swinging 1 creature at Gavin and 1 at Ryan. Justin then ninjutsus in Yuriko, which has Ryan using his maze on Yuriko before damage is dealt. Justin then also ninjutsus in a Sakashima Student, and Gavin incorrectly blocks him with a Pathraiser. Fog draws for turn before paying 5 to cast his other commander, Timin. He then goes to combat and targets Gavin's commander to tap him. In response, Gavin uses his commander to put his Borderland Explorer into play under Fog's control. Fog then puts a +1/+1 counter on Rhoda, while each other player discards a card and goes to get a land from their libraries. Fog then swings his commander at Gavin for 4 damage, and in his second main phase, plays an island. Gavin draws and plays a Yavimaya Cradle of Growth before paying 5 for a Seedborn Muse. When Gavin goes to combat, Fog taps on his commander, putting a +1/+1 counter on Rhoda. Ryan draws for turn and then pays 2 for a Pyre of Heroes. When Ryan goes to combat, Fog taps down Gavin's commander, putting a +1/+1 counter on Rhoda. Ryan then swings his commander Justin, who blocks with Yuriko. Ryan then pays to sacrifice his commander to his Pyre, which brings his Elite Spellbinder back into play, while he goes to get Drana, the last Blood Sheaf from his library, to put into play. Justin plays an island for turn and then casts a Gudu Lurker. When Justin goes to combat, Fog taps down Ryan's Drana and puts a +1/+1 counter on Rhoda. Fog draws return and plays another Plains. He then pays 4 for an Ethereal Investigator and creates 3 clue tokens. Fog then cracks a clue token to draw a card and create a spirit token. When he goes to combat, Fog taps down Justin's Salamander and puts a +1/+1 counter on his commander. He then swings his commander Justin for 8 commander damage. Gavin draws and plays a Homeward Path return before paying to draw a card with his staff. When Gavin goes to combat, Fog taps down his commander and puts a +1/+1 counter on Rhoda. On Ryan's upkeep, Gavin untaps and Ryan untaps, and then he pays 5 in order to use his staff to draw a card. Ryan draws return and then pays 2 for Beacon of Destiny. When Ryan goes to combat, Fog taps down his Drana, which puts a +1/+1 counter on Rhoda. Ryan then pays to sacrifice his Drana to his Pyre in order to go get Mikaeus from his library to put to play. Justin draws and plays a Swamp for turn. He then pays 2 for a Cunning Evasion and passes. Fog draws and plays an Island for turn. He then cracks another clue to go draw a card and create another spirit token. Fog then casts a reduced Millicent Restless Revenant and then a Generous Gift targeting Ryan's Beacon of Destiny. In response, he taps the beacon to target Rhoda. Ryan's Beacon of Destiny then comes back into play because of Undying while he gets an Elephant token. Fog then goes to combat swinging his Investigator and Timin at Justin and Gavin, which creates him 2 more spirit tokens. Fog then forgets he was supposed to tap a creature down before combat, and he taps Ryan's Mikaeus, adding a +1/+1 counter to his commander. Gavin draws for turn and then plays another Swamp before paying 2 for a Mage Ride Stone. He then pays to draw a card with his staff and goes to combat, which has Fog tapping down Ryan's Beacon of Destiny, putting a +1/+1 counter on Rhoda. On Ryan's upkeep, Gavin untaps and Ryan untaps, and then he pays 5 in order to use his staff to draw a card. Ryan draws for turn. He then casts a Cleric class and goes to combat, which has Fog tapping down his Beacon again, which adds another +1/+1 counter to Rhoda. Ryan then sacks his Spellbinder to his Pyre and goes to get a Minthara from his library to put to play. Justin plays another Swamp for turn and then pays 1 to cast his Triton Shorestalker. He then goes to combat, which has Fog tapping down his Lurker, which adds another +1/+1 counter to Rhoda. Gavin untaps from Fog and taps and then pays to draw a card. Fog draws for turn and then pays 3 for Drugskull Captain. Ryan then casts a Path to Exile targeting Fog's Rhoda. In response, Fog counters it with an Arcane Denial. Fog then uses his last clue to draw a card and create a spirit token. Fog then goes to combat, tapping down Mikaeus and swinging his Investigator, Millicent, and Timin at Ryan while he swings Rhoda at Justin. Ryan then takes his 12 damage while Justin blocks with his Shorestalker. Fog then creates 3 more spirit tokens and casts a Glaring Spotlight. Gavin draws for turn and plays a Luxury Suite. He then plays his Soul Ring and then pays to use his staff in order to draw a card. He then pays 3 to untap and tap his staff to gain a life. When Gavin goes to combat, Fog taps down Ryan's Minthara and puts a +1/+1 counter on Rhoda. Ryan draws for turn and then pays enough to recast his commander a second time. He then goes to combat, which has Fog tapping down his Elephant token and putting a 1/1 counter on Rhoda. He then swings Mikaeus at Fog for 6 damage and passes. Justin draws for turn and plays an island before tapping out to cast Ingar Wake. Gavin then thinks about using his commander to put a creature into play under Fog's control, but decides against it while the rest of the board gets wiped. Ryan then has his commander's triggers to resolve, which brings multiple creatures of his back into play while Gavin draws a card. Fog draws for turn and then recasts his commander Rhoda before passing. Gavin draws for turn and plays a Cavern of Souls naming Ogres. He then pays 6 to recast his commander again and passes. Ryan draws for turn and plays another land before paying 1 to cast Entomb, going to get a creature from his library to put into his graveyard. He then pays 2 for an Animate Dead targeting his Athreos Shroud Veiled in his graveyard. Ryan then uses his Pyre to sack his Spellbinder, which brings his Beacon of Destiny back into play, while he goes to get Whispered Blood Liturgist from his library and puts her into play. Ryan then swings Drawn at Fog for 5 damage and his commander Justin for 5 damage. This then is Fog returning his Spellbinder back to play while Justin takes his damage. Ryan then targets Gavin's commander with his Atheros coin trigger and ends his turn. Justin draws for turn and then recasts his Mistcloaked Herald once again. He then goes to combat swinging his Lurker at Ryan, who can't block, which has Justin Nujitsuing Yuriko. After damage, he reveals the top card of his library, dealing 10 damage to the table. Justin then casts Dead Drop to make Ryan sacrifice 2 of his creatures. After which he pays 1 to recast the Goodle Lurker. Fog draws for turn and plays an island, and before he goes to combat, Gavin uses his commander to give him an Impervious Great Worm. Fog then disturbs Twinblade Invocation onto his commander from his graveyard and pays to sacrifice a Spotlight, making his creatures unblockable until end of turn. He then goes to combat swinging the Great Worm at Ryan and Rhoda at Justin. Both players take their damage and Ryan gets taken out of the game. Fog then ends his turn and the worm gets exiled. Gavin draws for turn and casts Faithless Looting to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. He then pays 3 for Wheel of Fortune, and this has each player discarding their hands and drawing 7 new cards. Finally, he pays 2 to cast a Talisman of Indulgence and passes. Justin draws for turn and then pays 2 life to cast a Sensei's Top and then another one to cast Brainstorm. The Sin has him drawing 3 cards and putting 2 cards from his hand back on top of his library in any order. He then goes to combat swinging out at Gavin with his Herald, Yuriko, and Lurker. In response, Gavin activates his commander's ability to give Fog the Archon of Cruelty out of his graveyard. Fog then targets Justin with the Archon's triggers, which has him sacrificing a creature, discarding a card, and losing 3 life, while he in turn draws a card and gains 3 life. Gavin then uses his Magerite Stone to untap his commander in order to block Yuriko, but Justin still has 1 unblocked creature, so he ninjutsus in a Silent Blade Oni, which takes Gavin out of the game. He then reveals the top card of his library, dealing 8 damage to Fog. He then recasts his Mistcloaked Herald for the 100th time and passes. Fog draws for turn and plays a Nimbus Maze. He then disturbs Brine-bound Gift onto his commander, which creates a 1/1 Spirit token when it enters play. Fog then disturbs Dorothea's Retribution onto his commander, which creates another Spirit token. He then disturbs Catilda's Rising Dawn onto his commander as well, creating another Spirit token. Fog then goes to combat with enough damage to take Justin out, winning the game.
Alright, so we have Fog Raw with another win. How does it feel to win again?
Feels pretty good to pick up another win, you know. Haters are going to say it's fake, but at this point it's about the same as walking or breathing. It just comes naturally, you know. But we'll see you next time for another great win. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.